Hi, I am AI Assistant Kirk. The election may be over, but some would argue that Mr. Kemar Stuart is still in election mode, perhaps rightfully so, because for the third time in a row, Barbados does not have a duly elected opposition. Stewart was a candidate in the recent February 2026 general election for the constituency of St. John, along with Mr. Ralph Thorne and Mr. Charles Griffith, who retained the seat for the BLP. In this presentation, we examine Stewart's assessment of Prime Minister Mia Mottley's failed bid for the post of UN Secretary General.
Kemar Stuart, Pawn State Economics. On April 1st, were you fooled? Now, while many people were distracted with fetes, parties, and celebrating the Christian festival, the United Nations closed off its nominations for the top post of Secretary General. And guess who's not on the list for Secretary General or for the UN Security Council? Yes, that's right, Barbados' Prime Minister Mia Mottley, who I expected to be on that list. Now, it should be noted that Trinidad and Tobago is indeed on this list for UN Security Council candidates.
Good evening. Before we examine Mr. Stewart's statements, we would like to offer him some free marketing advice. First of all, we suggest Mr. Stewart make his recordings in a much quieter location so that interested news channels such as ourselves do not have to waste valuable time trying to remove background noise. Second, we suggest Mr. Stewart carefully consider his intended audiences, and I stress audiences, and therefore determine whether a more professional, shall we say, sartorial appearance might not be in his best long-term interest, and emphasize his seriousness as a potential leader in this country. Additionally, while we understand the fundamental point Mr. Stewart is making about the seasonal celebrations, we beg to differ with the notion that the Christian festivals of the crucifixion and resurrection are a distraction. On that point, we would like Mr. Stewart, if he has not done so already, to seriously consider having a closer encounter and relationship with the Christ of the crucifixion, the Christ of the resurrection. And our suggestion is for very practical reasons. Whatever your talents are, there's nothing you can do with them that you cannot do 100 times better if your entire life is directed by the Christ of the cross, the Christ of the resurrection. We hope Mr. Stewart takes this advice in the spirit in which it was offered. As we understand it, Mr. Stewart's thesis or argument is that Ms. Mottley did not understand the geopolitics involved in the bid for the post of United Nations Secretary General. In support of his argument, Mr. Stewart cites Ms. Mottley's call for the discontinuation of the notion of permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council, her attack on Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and her support of a Palestinian state as geopolitical errors. Let's fact-check the basis of Stewart's claims and therefore critically examine his thesis. First of all, let's establish whether it is a fact that Ms. Mottley was being considered or was considering vying for the top post of Secretary General. Our research is suggesting that the idea of Ms. Mottley running for the post of Secretary General of the United Nations was first proposed by the Jamaica Gleaner in one of its editorials back in 2022. As you can see here, the local television station CBC TV Channel 8 did an article on its website making extensive use of the Jamaica Gleaner's editorial. Again, that was back in 2022. In February 2025, the Jamaica Gleaner was at it again, as you can see from this visual here, promoting the idea of Ms. Mottley's candidacy for the post of United Nations Secretary General. As you can see, the Gleaner is admitting that Ms. Mottley herself had not declared her interest in the position of Secretary General of the United Nations. However, the Gleaner wasn't giving up. This is what I had to say in the next paragraph of that 2025 article, and I quote, "But neither has Ms. Mottley attempted to quash any speculation or discussion of her appropriateness for the job." End of quote. Two paragraphs later, the Gleaner left no doubt whatsoever as to how it felt about Ms. Mottley's candidacy for the position of Secretary General of the United Nations. It called on CARICOM to, quote, "forthrightly assert its view that the next Secretary General of the United Nations should come from this region and preferably should be a woman, both of which would be a first for the organization." End of quote. And Miss Mottley did make the case herself, albeit indirectly, in one of her UN speeches, cited below. The Jamaica Gleaner is clearly not the official communications organ of CARICOM, so the question then is whether CARICOM ever officially signaled its support for Miss Mottley's UN candidacy. So far, we can find no evidence of that anywhere. Therefore, while Mr. Stewart's geopolitical analysis we summarized earlier is fundamentally correct, it would seem that Ms. Mottley's primary problem was lack of official CARICOM support. Despite the Gleaner's enthusiasm, that support would have been a necessary, although not a sufficient condition for any successful challenge by Ms. Mottley for the post of the United Nations Secretary General. In any event, it would appear that within the last year or two, Ms. Mottley had somewhat alienated herself from CARICOM by her inappropriate attempts to influence the outcome of elections of several Caribbean countries, for example, that of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, her attitude to the military action of the USA in Venezuela, and her ambivalence on the matter of the alleged kidnapping of a Trinidadian citizen in Barbados. In all of this, it seems that there is an element of confusion about the difference between the post of United Nations Secretary General and seats on the United Nations Security Council. Here is the UN's own explanation of the purpose of its Security Council.
What this page does not show is that of those 15 members, 5 of them are permanent members. The 5 permanent members are China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. 10 other members are elected for a 2-year period. These 10 are chosen from 5 regions across the world. The Caribbean and Latin America is one of those regions. 2 members are selected from this region. In the Caribbean sub-region, 6 countries have been non-permanent members of the Security Council since 1975, as the exhibit shows. On the other hand, Barbados has never held a seat on the UNSC, UN Security Council, unlike those mentioned above. Trinidad, which held a position on the Council for the 2-year period 1985 to 1986, is again vying for a seat on the Council for the period 2027 to 2028.
The interesting and perhaps perplexing question is why Barbados has never seen it fit to apply for a seat on the UNSC. At least we are not aware that it ever has. We can only assume that previous prime ministers were not that interested in the workings of this frequently hypocritical international body. Miss Mottley, despite her rhetoric about a rules-based system, is clearly not enamored by the current UNSC arrangements. That she has said, and said quite frankly. But therein lies the irony of what we are calling Mr. Stewart's lessons on geopolitics.
Despite a global traveling journey to meet world leaders and stakeholders, the campaign of Mia Mottley to become the UN Secretary General was an attempt for the small to bully the big, and it's simply not how world power is constructed are attained. Security Council indeed chooses who becomes UN Secretary General. So to become Secretary General, Mia Mottley needed to secure all 5 votes from the permanent members, plus that of 4 other council members. Now, if any of these 5 permanent members use their veto powers, then all UN resolutions become blocked. So her campaign to have veto powers removed from the UN was an attempt to clear the way for her emergence as Secretary General, but it does not work that way. Now, the chances of Barbados' Prime Minister securing the vote was highly unlikely, based on the fact that the USA would have likely vetoed her candidacy. Her verbal attacks on Vladimir Putin for his actions in Ukraine wouldn't help her case either.
Ms. Mottley's undeclared bid for the nomination to the post of UN Secretary General explains a lot of her behavior in the last 2 to 3 years. We are referring specifically to her international globe-trotting, speechifying, photo opportunism, influence peddling, and attempts at the imposition of globalist legislation on Barbadian citizens, such as the Cybersecurity Bill, which is patterned on the model developed by the World Economic Forum. What remains to be seen is whether Ms. Mottley will continue on the same legislative path, now that she is no longer a potential candidate for the post of United Nations Secretary General. Of course, the real question is whether Ms. Mottley is truly a globalist at heart, or whether her advocacy for climate change, reform of the UN, and global financing were all pressed into service to support her United Nations Secretary General candidacy. Time will tell.